The Hollow Ones. I was 17 the night my little sister, Emily, disappeared. That summer, the heat pressed down on our old farmhouse like a smothering hand, making sleep feel impossible. Our home sat on the edge of the woods, a place where the trees grew too close together, their branches knotting like tangled fingers. Something about those woods always felt wrong, like they were watching. Emily had been restless for weeks, waking in the middle of the night, mumbling about voices in the trees. She was only 10, still prone to nightmares, so my parents dismissed it as an overactive imagination. But I knew better. I had heard them too. The night she vanished. I woke to the sound of wind chimes. Soft at first, like glass tapping against itself. Then louder, sharper, like bones knocking together. We didn't own wind chimes. A cold sensation slithered up my spine as I sat up. My room was bathed in the pale glow of the full moon, shadows stretching long and thin across the wooden floor. Everything was still. Too still. Then came the whispering. Not from inside the house. From the woods. A chorus of voices, layered and wrong, like they were speaking in reverse. My stomach twisted as I slid out of bed and crept down the hallway to Emily's room. Her door was open, her curtains fluttering in the still night air. The bed was empty. The window was wide open. I rushed to it, heart hammering. Below, in the moonlit yard, the grass was flattened in a perfect path leading to the tree line. And then I saw them. Figures. Tall and thin, their limbs too long, their heads tilted like curious dogs. Their skin was gray, stretched tight over skeletal frames, their faces featureless except for wide, yawning mouths. They stood at the edge of the woods, waiting. And Emily was walking toward them. Her nightgown billowed as she moved, slow and deliberate, like she was in a trance. I didn't think, I just ran. I bolted across the yard, feet slapping against the cold earth. Emily! I screamed, but she didn't react. She stepped past the first line of trees, disappearing into the darkness. A hand brushed my ankle. I tripped. I landed hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. When I looked up, something was moving beneath the dirt. The ground shifted, small hands pressing up from the soil, fingers, tiny fingers, pushing through the earth. I scrambled back, choking on a scream. Dozens of hands, child-sized, burst from the dirt, grasping, reaching. And the whispering grew louder. Help us. Help us. Help us. I yanked free and ran, lungs burning. The trees swallowed me whole. The Hollow Ones. The deeper I went, the colder it became. My breath puffed in white clouds. The air smelled of damp earth and rot. Then I saw her. Emily stood in a clearing, arms at her sides. The Hollow Ones encircled her, their heads twitching, their grins stretching wider. Emily! I gasped, reaching for her. She turned. Her eyes, once bright, full of mischief, were black pits, yawning voids of nothing. Her mouth moved, but the words that came weren't hers. It's too late. A hand clamped onto my shoulder. I whirled. A Hollow One loomed over me, its breath like ice against my skin. Its grin widened, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. A clicking sound came from its throat, the same bone-rattling sound as the wind chimes. Something moved beneath its skin. Shapes, faces, pressed against the inside of its flesh. Tiny mouths opened in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. Children. They were inside it. I turned back to Emily, heart thundering. You have to come with me. Her lips curled in that too wide grin. No, big brother. A hand, too many fingers, too cold, wrapped around my wrist. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was Emily's face, her empty eyes watching as I was dragged beneath the earth. Buried. I woke in my bed. Sunlight streamed through the window. The house was silent. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought it had been a nightmare. Then I noticed the dirt beneath my fingernails. The sheets smelled of damp earth. And Emily was gone. The police never found her. My parents never forgave me. I never forgave myself. 15 years later. I moved far away, tried to forget. But the past doesn't stay buried. On the night of my daughter's 7th birthday, I woke to the sound of wind chimes. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I shot up in bed. The house was too quiet. Then I noticed it, her bedroom door, wide open. Her bed was empty. The window was open. And outside, beneath the street lamp, they stood. Tall. Thin. Grinning. And my daughter was walking toward them. I bolted, bare feet slamming against the floor. Emily. I screamed, no, not Emily, her name. My daughter's name. She turned. And her eyes were black as tar. I stopped cold, my breath coming in short gasps. From the darkness, the whispering began again. The sound of hollow chimes. A hand brushed my ankle. And I knew, with a soul-crushing certainty, I had never really escaped. The Hollow Ones, Part 2. The street was dead silent. My daughter, Lily, stood frozen in the middle of the road, her tiny frame bathed in the glow of the street lamp. She didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stood there with her hands limp at her sides, her nightgown rippling in the unnatural wind. And beyond her, at the edge of the trees, they waited. The Hollow Ones. Tall. Thin. Grinning. I ran, screaming her name. She took another step forward. That's when I heard the growl. A deep, throaty snarl from the neighbor's yard. Something shot past me, a blur of matted fur and muscle. Rex. Old Man Gardner's dog. The massive German shepherd lunged for Lily, but at the last second, he twisted mid-air and snapped his jaws around something I couldn't see. A high-pitched screech tore through the night. The air rippled, like heat rising off pavement. The Hollow Ones twitched, their bodies jerking in unnatural spasms. Rex dug his teeth in deeper, growling as if he had latched onto something solid, something real. And then, the thing bit back. A sickening crunch. Rex howled, stumbling backward, his hind leg bent at a horrible angle. Blood sprayed across the pavement. The Hollow Ones took a step forward. I grabbed Lily and ran. She thrashed in my arms, screaming in that strange, layered voice. Her small hands clawed at my face, tearing at my skin. Let me go. Let me go. But it wasn't her voice. It was theirs. I barely made it to the house before she sank her teeth into my shoulder. I screamed, nearly dropping her. My vision blurred from the pain, hot blood soaking my shirt. But I didn't stop. I barreled through the front door, kicking it shut behind me. Lily went limp. She collapsed in my arms, her breath ragged, her little body shivering like she had been dropped into ice water. And outside, the Hollow Ones whispered. They weren't finished. Not yet. The police arrive. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, the house was swarming with police. Detective Alan Crowley stood over me, his arms crossed, his lined face twisted in an expression of deep skepticism. Let me get this straight, he said. You're telling me your daughter, your 7-year-old daughter, walked outside in the middle of the night, got possessed by something, and then a dog saved her? I swallowed. My throat felt like sandpaper. I'm telling you the truth. Crowley exhaled through his nose. He was a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a permanent scowl, the kind of cop who had seen enough that nothing surprised him anymore. Or so I thought. Another officer approached him, looking pale. Sir, he said, voice tight, you might want to see this. Crowley shot me a look before following him outside. I stood, unsteady, and trailed behind them. Rex lay in the driveway, panting heavily, his injured leg twisted unnaturally. Blood pooled beneath him, but it wasn't just his blood. Something else lay nearby. Something wrong. A shape, barely visible, its edges flickering like a bad signal. It was humanoid, but not quite. Its limbs bent in the wrong places, its skin rippling, shifting. Where its face should have been, there was only a gaping, twitching hole. The officers stood frozen, guns drawn but useless. Then it moved. Not toward them, toward the child standing behind them. Officer Ramos. Young, new to the force. He had brought his toddler, Cody, with him, left him strapped in the car, thinking it was safe. But the back door was open. The kid was outside. Rex moved first. Despite his broken leg, despite the blood loss, the dog lunged, snatching Cody by the back of his onesie and bolting. The hollow one shrieked. A gust of wind ripped through the yard. The air turned black, shadows twisting into screaming faces, mouths gaping in soundless terror. Then, just as suddenly, the wind stopped. The shadows vanished. And the hollow ones were gone. Only the wind chimes remained, clattering in the unnatural silence. The aftermath. Rex limped into the woods that night, still carrying Cody. They never found him. The police searched for weeks. Bloodhounds, helicopters, even a psychic, nothing. It was like the dog had stepped out of reality itself. And deep down, I knew. He had taken the boy somewhere safe. Somewhere the hollow ones couldn't reach. But they would come back. They always did. 2 weeks later. Lily wouldn't speak. She just sat by the window, staring at the trees. Sometimes, at night, I heard her whispering. Not words. Not English. Something else. And last night. I heard the wind chimes again. But this time. They were inside the house. The Hollow Ones, Part 3. The wind chimes clattered from somewhere inside the house. I shot upright in bed, heart hammering. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a soft, bone-like clicking, echoing through the dark hallways. I reached for my phone, but the screen was dead. No charge. No signal. Something was in the house. A rustling noise came from the living room, followed by a single, deliberate creak of the floorboards. I swallowed hard. Lily? No response. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my muscles tight with fear. Every step felt agonizingly slow as I crept toward the hallway. The air was thick, heavy, like I was wading through something unseen. And then I heard her. Soft. Whispering. They're inside now. I turned the corner, and my stomach dropped. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor in the middle of the living room, her nightgown damp with sweat, her tiny hands gripping something in her lap. A toy? No. A human tooth. Her lips curled into a slow, eerie smile. They're inside now, she repeated. And the closet door behind her creaked open. The police return. I don't remember calling them. Maybe I did. Maybe they did. All I know is that an hour later, Detective Crowley was back, standing in my doorway with 2 officers, his face lined with exhaustion. You again, he muttered. What now? I didn't even have words. I just gestured toward Lily, who sat motionless on the couch, still gripping that awful little tooth. One of the officers, Ramos, the same guy who lost his kid, stepped forward cautiously. Hey, sweetheart, he said gently. Where'd you get that? Lily's eyes flicked toward him, then toward the closet. Them, she whispered. Ramos hesitated, then sighed and reached for the door. All right, let's. Bang. The closet door slammed shut on its own. The entire house shook. The lights flickered wildly, the air filling with a deep, guttural rattling, like 1,000 voices whispering at once. Crowley swore, reaching for his gun. What the hell? The front door exploded open. A burst of wind tore through the room, sending papers, books, and furniture flying. The officers staggered back as the shadows seemed to bend and shift, twisting into long, thin shapes. The hollow ones were here. And they weren't hiding anymore. Ramos is bitten. Ramos was the first to scream. One of the hollow ones lunged from the shadows, its elongated fingers grabbing his face. His scream cut off in a wet, gurgling noise as his body convulsed, jerking unnaturally. The thing opened its mouth, too wide, its jaw cracking open, and bent toward him. Crowley fired. The bullet tore through the hollow one's head, but it barely flinched. It turned toward the detective and grinned. Ramos suddenly snapped back to life. He let out a strangled howl, his body jerking violently. His eyes, once brown, had turned pure black. And then he bit Officer Dunham. Hard. Blood sprayed across the wall. Dunham screamed, shoving him back, but Ramos clung to him like a rabid animal. His teeth sank into the flesh of Dunham's shoulder. Crowley grabbed my arm, dragging me backward. We need to go. Lily, still on the couch, watched with wide, fascinated eyes. And then she did something that froze my blood. She laughed. The dog returns. The hollow ones didn't stop coming. They poured from the shadows, their bodies stretching unnaturally, their long fingers reaching. The walls seemed to warp around them, the air thick with their whispers. Then a low growl echoed through the chaos. Something fast barreled into the house. A flash of teeth and fur. A blur of movement. Rex. The missing dog. With Cody still clutched in his jaws. Rex leapt at Ramos, snapping his neck in one violent motion. The officer collapsed instantly, his body twitching. Dunham, still bleeding from his bite, stumbled away in shock. Rex turned toward the hollow ones. His lips curled back in a snarl. They froze. For the first time, the hollow ones looked afraid. Rex charged. He lunged at the nearest one, tearing into its throat. A piercing, otherworldly shriek filled the air. The creature writhed, its form flickering violently, like a bad TV signal, before vanishing entirely. Rex landed, growling, blood dripping from his mouth. And the hollow ones retreated. Not gone. Not dead. But afraid. And in that moment, I realized something. They could be hurt. The final horror. Lily stood from the couch, eyes locked on Rex. Her small fingers clenched into fists. They don't like you, she murmured. Her voice was wrong. Layered. Echoing. And then her head snapped toward me, and she smiled. Too wide. Too wrong. They're not done with me yet. And before I could stop her, she ran into the darkness. Right back to them. The Hollow Ones, Part 4. Lily ran straight into the shadows. I lunged after her, but Crowley grabbed me, holding me back. No. You'll never make it, he shouted. His grip was iron-tight, his face set in a grim scowl. But she's my daughter. I roared, struggling. She's already gone. His words hit me like a hammer to the chest. No. No, I wouldn't accept that. Rex stood at the edge of the darkness, hackles raised, his breath ragged. The massive German shepherd didn't move, he just watched the shifting blackness where Lily had disappeared, his ears flattened, his tail stiff. He growled once. Low. Warning. Then, he whimpered. And I knew. She wasn't alone in there. The police mobilize. An hour later, my house was surrounded. Flashing red and blue lights painted the street in eerie, pulsing colors. More than a dozen officers lined up along my lawn, their guns trained on the woods. Crowley stood at the center, barking orders into his radio. "This is bigger than some ghost story," he muttered under his breath, shoving a fresh clip into his pistol. "I just lost a damn man back there." "And Ramos?" "He bit Dunham." I looked at the injured officer, sitting in the back of an ambulance. He was pale, sweating through his uniform, clutching his shoulder where the bite had sunk deep. Crowley exhaled sharply. "It's spreading," he said. I turned to him. "What do you mean?" "Dunham," he said, nodding toward the ambulance. "He's changing." As if on cue, Dunham let out a strangled cry. His body convulsed. I saw his eyes blacken. And then he lunged for the paramedic's throat. The infection. Dunham tore into the paramedic's neck with his teeth. Blood sprayed onto the asphalt. The poor woman collapsed, gurgling, her hands clutching at her ruined throat. Dunham, twitching violently, turned toward us. His jaw was too wide, his limbs stiff and unnatural. "Jesus Christ," one officer whispered. "Shoot him," Crowley ordered. A gunshot rang out. Dunham's head snapped back as a bullet punched through his forehead. But he didn't stop. He took another step forward, blood oozing from the wound, his lips curled into something that wasn't a human expression. Another gunshot. This time, the back of his head exploded. His body swayed. Then he collapsed. Dead. Silence fell over the street. Then the hollow ones laughed. Soft. Distant. Carried on the wind. Into the woods. Crowley turned to me. "Whatever the hell this is, we end it tonight." I nodded. We geared up. 7 officers, plus me. Flashlights, rifles, extra ammunition. Crowley took point, leading us into the woods where Lily had disappeared. Rex walked beside me, his ears flat, his steps cautious. He was wounded, limping, but refused to leave my side. We pushed forward. The deeper we went, the darker it got. Even our flashlights seemed useless, their beams swallowed by the shifting, whispering blackness. Then, one by one, the lights went out. The hollow nest. The darkness swallowed us whole. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The only sound was the officer's ragged breathing and the distant, hollow chiming of something unnatural. Then I heard her. "Daddy." My heart nearly burst from my chest. "Lily." I turned wildly, trying to find her. "Baby, where are you?" A pause. Then, closer this time. "Daddy, I'm right here." A hand brushed my arm. Cold. Small. Not right. I turned. And saw her. Lily stood in the darkness, her nightgown torn and dirty, her hair tangled. Her lips parted in a small, trembling smile. For a second, just a second, she looked like my little girl. Then she grinned. Too wide. Too wrong. And from behind her, the hollow ones emerged. All hell breaks loose. The creatures spilled from the shadows, their elongated bodies jerking and twitching unnaturally. One officer screamed. Another opened fire. Bullets ripped through the night. But the hollow ones didn't fall. They moved like smoke, weaving through the gunfire with inhuman speed. Their mouths gaped open, revealing nothing inside. And then they took the first officer. He let out a strangled scream as black tendrils shot from one of the creatures, wrapping around his limbs, pulling him into the void. Gone. Just like that. Crowley shouted something, but I didn't hear it. Because Lily stepped closer. She reached for my hand. "Come with me, Daddy," she whispered. "I want you to meet them." The hollow ones lurched forward. And that's when Rex attacked. The last stand. The dog lunged at Lily. And she shrieked. A sound not human. Not a child's scream. Something ancient. Something wrong. The hollow ones flinched. The darkness shuddered. And in that moment, I knew. Rex was the key. I grabbed Crowley's arm. "They're afraid of him." Crowley's eyes widened. "Then we use him." The officers regrouped, backing toward me, forming a circle. Rex snarled, snapping at the creatures, forcing them back. And then the wind ripped through the woods. The hollow ones let out a collective, inhuman screech. And then they vanished. The darkness lifted. And in the clearing, Lily collapsed. Her body limp. Her tiny chest rising and falling in ragged, shallow breaths. I fell to my knees beside her, pulling her into my arms. "Baby?" She didn't answer. Her eyes fluttered open. And when she spoke, her voice was her own. "Daddy? But it's not over." We carried Lily back. The surviving officers stumbled from the woods, their faces pale, their hands trembling. Crowley turned to me. "Is it over?" I swallowed. I didn't know. Lily was back. She was warm. Breathing. But as I held her, I felt something cold in her pocket. Something small. I reached inside and pulled it out. A human tooth. And from somewhere, far away, but growing closer, I heard the wind chimes.